Hello everyone, my name is Hubert and welcome to Teach Me channel. Today we are going to be talking about inheritance. We will cover how inheritance works and what it does, and how we can predict what characteristics offspring will have based on the parents' characteristics. Now, let's first cover some definitions and some basics. First of all, what are genes? Genes control what characteristics we inherit. Each gene controls a different characteristic, or genes can also come together to control a single characteristic. However, their main job is to control which characteristics we inherit. Now, alleles are a different versions of the same gene. Now, how do we get people with blue eyes? How do we get people with green eyes? How do we get people with brown eyes? You know, hamsters with brown fur, hamsters with black fur. That's all because of these guys. That's all because of alleles. Now, alleles have the same location on a chromosome, i.e. they are essentially the same gene, and they code for the same characteristic. However, they can have different versions of them. So, for example, one allele can code for green eyes, another allele can code for brown eyes, another allele could code for blue eyes. Now, an important thing to consider is that we get two alleles. We inherit for each characteristic, for each gene, we inherit two alleles. We inherit one allele from a father, and we inherit one allele from mother. And then, based on the alleles that we inherit, they will come together and they will actually decide what characteristic we inherit at the end of the day. Now, alleles can be dominant or recessive. Actually, there are more groups, but as far as GCSE biology is concerned, we will cover those extra groups, but for now, as far as we're concerned, alleles can be either dominant or they can be recessive. Now, what it means? It means that if two alleles come together, the characteristic that you will get is the characteristic encoded by the dominant allele. We will get the characteristic encoded by the dominant allele. Now, so for example, if you inherit one allele for blue eyes and one allele for brown eyes are actually a dominant allele, so then you would have brown eyes at the end of it, even though you would have recessive allele for blue eyes. Well, that sort of explains what recessive is. Recessive means essentially non-dominant, so if we put recessive allele together with a dominant allele, then we will not see that characteristic. We will see the characteristic that is carried by a dominant allele. I will show you later on. We will work through an example and it will become much, much clearer. So if you don't understand exactly what I'm saying now, you will understand it in the next couple of minutes or so. Now, phenotype. What is phenotype? Phenotype is the actual characteristic that we inherit. Phenotype, for example, could be brown eyes, or phenotype could be, B plus blood group. Phenotype could be brown hair. Phenotype could be, blonde hair, anything. Phenotype means essentially a characteristic that we inherit. A good way that I like to think about phenotype is what we see at the end of the day. Phenotype is the characteristic that we actually notice at the end of the day. Now, what is genotype? Genotype is sort of similar to phenotype, but not quite. Genotype is combination of alleles that we inherit. And that is different because, of course, you can combine two alleles, but you only see characteristic of one of them. So, of course, this is how genotype can differ to phenotype, because genotype concerns the actual alleles that we inherit. And again, I will show you in an example very soon how it all works. So, this is the basics, but let's move on to the example. Let's move on to the more exciting stuff. Okay, so I will teach you how to do genetic diagrams. I'm going to put it down for you. Diagrams. Now, genetic diagrams are a useful way of predicting what alleles will offspring inherit from parents and what characteristics, therefore, offspring will inherit. So, let's take, for example, a disease called cystic fibrosis. I'm going to write it down for you. Cystic fibrosis. And in short, it's CF. That's what I'm going to call it from now on. Cystic fibrosis is actually carried by a recessive allele. I'm going to write it down. So cystic fibrosis disease is actually carried by a single recessive allele. So now let's plan out the alleles that we are going to be using. So capital C is going to be healthy. And lowercase c will be cystic fibrosis. So as we can see, the big C, the dominant allele, is the healthy allele, and then the recessive, small c, the recessive allele, is carrying cystic fibrosis. Now, let's dress it up in a little scenario. We have a family tree here. So we have a father here who is unaffected. He has no cystic fibrosis alleles whatsoever. And we have mother, who unfortunately happens to be a carrier of cystic fibrosis. What does carrier mean? Well, carrier means that a person has an allele that encodes for a certain disease. For example, cystic fibrosis in this case. She has an allele that encodes for cystic fibrosis. However, she is not experiencing any symptoms of it. She doesn't experience any illness. She looks completely fine. She is completely fine. However, she carries that allele. So that's why we call such a person, we would call them a carrier of the disease. Why we call them a carrier of disease is because they carry disease. They can pass this allele on to the offspring, as you will see later on. So, anyway. So these two are they have 3 kids. They have a daughter who is completely fine. She has no cystic fibrosis alleles. We have a son who also has no cystic fibrosis alleles. And then, unfortunately, we have a son who is also a carrier of cystic fibrosis. And now that son has a child with a woman who also has cystic fibrosis allele, but she is also a carrier. None of them actually experience symptoms. So the question is this. What alleles will their offspring carry, and what is the risk that their offspring will actually have the disease? What's the risk that their kids, unfortunately, may have cystic fibrosis? So now, in order to figure that out, we need to create a genetic diagram. So we're going to take all of this over there. We're going to circle that this is what we're concerned with. I'm going to move this over there. So, we need to create a genetic diagram to predict the alleles that offspring will have, and therefore the genotype and phenotype that the offspring will have. So, first let's start with parents. Now, their phenotype is healthy, as we talked. Their phenotype is healthy because, as we said, they are carriers. They don't actually have the disease. However, their genotypes, because they are carriers, is actually, because they're carriers, and we know that cystic fibrosis is recessive, the only possible combination of alleles they would have is one healthy allele, large C, and one cystic fibrosis allele, lowercase c. And that is the case for both parents, because they're both carriers. Because that is the only way that they can be healthy whilst also carrying a cystic fibrosis allele. Now, if somebody has two of the same version of an allele, they would be called homozygous. Homozygous dominant, if those two alleles are dominant, or homozygous recessive, if those two alleles were recessive. However, if somebody has two different alleles, then they would be called, for that particular characteristic, for that particular gene, they would be called heterozygous. Now, so these two are actually heterozygous for cystic fibrosis allele. So now let's create a genetic diagram. Now, there's few ways of doing this, but in my opinion, the simplest and the most straightforward way to do this is via Punnett square. So what do? We draw up a square like this. We draw up a square, we split it in 4, and now we will put down all of parents' alleles separately. So we put down one parent here, capital C and lowercase c, and we put down another parent here, capital C and lowercase c. And now, like a table, we read off the alleles that offspring will inherit. So here we have two capital C's, so we have CC. Here we have one capital C, one lowercase c, so heterozygous. This is homozygous dominant. Here we have another capital C and lowercase c, so that's another heterozygous. And here we have, unfortunately, two lowercase c's, so that's homozygous recessive, and these would have cystic fibrosis. So now let's summarize offspring. I'm going to write it down here. So let's summarize the genotype first. Okay, so this table is representative of offspring, and we could use the ratios shown by this table to determine how many of their children would we expect to have each genotype, by multiplying this, scaling it up or down. So, for example, if they had 4 kids, we would expect one kid to have this, one kid to have this, one kid to have this, one kid to have this. If we had 8 children, for example, if they had 8 children, then obviously we double up on everything. So 2 children would be expected to have this, 2 children expected to have this, 2 expected to have this, 2 expected to have this. Anyway, moving on. So what is the genotype ratios? What's the genotype split here? Now, let's see. So we have one homozygous dominant, we have one homozygous recessive, and we have 2 heterozygous. So out of 4, 1 here is 25% of 2 capital C's, 50% of the heterozygous, 50% of capital C and lowercase c, 50% of capital C and lowercase c, and 25% of lowercase c's. Okay, so that is their genotype. Now we can see how it differs to phenotype. I'm going to write it down here, phenotype. Now let's have a look. So phenotype, as we talked, is the characteristic that they would inherit at the end of the day. Whatever the genotype is, what that genotype would tell you about the offspring. So as we can see, these guys have 2 healthy alleles, and these guys have 1 healthy allele and 1 cystic fibrosis allele. Now, considering cystic fibrosis is a recessive disease, all of these guys would be healthy at the end of the day. Okay. However, these guys, 25% of the offspring, unfortunately, would be expected to have cystic fibrosis. Unfortunately. So their phenotypes would be, we add these two up, so 75% of the offspring would be healthy, and unfortunately 25% of the offspring would have cystic fibrosis. Okay, so this is it for today. So as you can see, using genetic diagrams, we can predict what we expect the offspring to have. However, one important point to mention is that this is only as an estimate. The actual values may differ. For example, all of their kids may actually not even be carried. They may be completely unaffected. Unfortunately, likewise, all of their kids could be sick with cystic fibrosis. It completely depends on how the genes, how the alleles are going to mix. However, this is what we would mathematically expect the offspring to show. So, this is it for today. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it, guys. If you want to stay up to date with daily science, maths and university level biomedical sciences videos, hit that subscribe button below. If you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up. Again, thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, put it down in comments. I'm more than happy. I love replying to your questions, guys. And see you next time.